You shouldn't need a law degree to start a barber shop, but entrepreneurs across the country face steep fees, delays, and confusing requirements before they ever even open. That's why, in addition to suing cities when they violate people's rights, IJ works with cities to make it cheaper, faster, and simpler to start a small business. I'm Kim Norberg of the nonprofit civil liberties law firm, the Institute for Justice, joined by co-host Keith Neely, Assistant Director of IJ's Activism team, Jennifer McDonald, and Senior Policy Advisor Chad Reese to discuss how IJ makes cities work. This is Beyond the Brief. So it won't come as a surprise to anyone that there's a lot of red tape involved in starting a small business. So what kind of hurdles do entrepreneurs have to jump through?
Entrepreneurs have to jump through, I think, more individual hurdles than anybody really comprehends. So our research has found that on average, it takes about 55 steps involving 8 different government agencies to open a barbershop, for example. To open a restaurant in Austin, Texas, it takes over 100 different steps. San Francisco requires more than $20,000 just in permit fees alone to open a restaurant. And sometimes, these individual things may not seem so big on their own, but when you put them all together, they really add up. And I think very few people have an actual picture of what that looks like on the whole.
What are some examples of things that entrepreneurs have gone through that you guys have seen?
Well, Jenny mentioned some of the bigger cities, but I think one interesting thing that we've learned through cities work is that these issues really run the gamut across the country. And I think of Minneapolis as a classic example. So in that barriers to business study, of all the cities we looked at, Minneapolis had the largest number of government departments that you have to engage with. It's 14 different agencies or departments. They have over 100 license categories. So if you are just starting out and you want to figure out what the heck piece of paper do I even need, you've got to sift through 100 different business types and their government descriptions, even to figure out where you need to be sending your application. And then on the cost side, there's a specific sewer access charge that Minneapolis businesses have to go through, and it's based on your square footage. But if you want a relatively small 1,000 square foot restaurant in the city, you're looking at least $8,000 probably for that fee alone, in addition to all your other licenses and your permits.
Chad, you mentioned barriers to business, a study that IJ put together. Could you give our viewers a little sense of what the scope of that project was and how many cities we looked at?
Yeah, it's a great question because in a lot of ways, we wanted barriers to business to exist when we first started doing this kind of licensing and permitting work. So we did a lot of research and kept asking ourselves, why the heck isn't there just a study out here that looks at cities and says, well, this is how many steps it takes in this city and this is how much it costs in another city. And then we started doing the research and found out, well, it doesn't exist because it's really hard to do. But what IJ was able to do is put together a case study of 20 different cities across the country. They vary in size, and we tried to maintain a lot of geographic diversity as well, that identifies specific business types. So we create a sample imaginary restaurant that costs a certain amount in permit fees, for instance, and has a certain number of employees. And then we literally run those business types through each city's licensing and permitting process to decide how many steps it takes, like Jenny was saying, what the total number of fees cost. So for the first time, we were able to actually get an apples to apples comparison of what it's like to start a business in one city versus another. And we've done a lot of research since then, but that barriers to business report still kind of remains the landmark study for us and what got us off to the races.
Jenny, I know that you have a lot of experience working in these sorts of studies. What was the most kind of alarming thing to come out of this study, or what was the worst city in your view to try to start a business in?
I get asked a lot which city is like the worst, and the thing is they all do terrible things and they all do good things, right? So, for example, in Shreveport, Louisiana, the cost to start a business is relatively low compared to the other cities that we've looked at, but their processes are so opaque that it's difficult to navigate them. So the number of steps might be a little bit lower, but you have to physically go to the police department to get a form to physically fill out in order to serve alcohol. And so I think what we learn as we do more and more of this research is that each city is unique, and I think that's one of the reasons that cities want to work with us, because we tell them, like, look, we're not out here to make you look bad or look worse than your neighbors, but we're here to say, look, this is something where you really have a weakness, and here's what you can do to fix that. And here's how we will tailor specific recommendations to your unique situation.
The thing that stands out to me about this is, you guys are experts. You've, gone through this process for a whole bunch of different cities and different types of businesses. For a regular person who's trying to start this up, they don't have that knowledge. They're kind of walking into it, from square one with kind of no idea where to even start. And so a lot of the kind of like picayune things that different inspectors and, various parts of the process can get hung up on seem kind of crazy. Can you explain some of the specific things that people have kind of confronted that you've worked with?
We met an entrepreneur in Fort Worth named Mama Gina, who is a pillar of the community. She's wonderful. She uses her restaurant to help feed the homeless. She's just fantastic. And she was told that she needed to install a 750-gallon grease trap into her restaurant, even though she doesn't fry any food. She doesn't have fryers in her restaurant. So she went to City Hall and said, this is ridiculous. And they said, okay, we'll negotiate it down to 500 gallons. But the problem is a grease trap of that capacity is the size of like a VW bus. It has to be installed under the ground, outside behind the restaurant, and it could cost tens of thousands of dollars to install one of these. And so that type of regulation is something that may not pop up in our research, but it's something that when we're meeting entrepreneurs and talking to them about their individual situations, we hear about that. And so now when we go to cities all the time, we say, hey, what are your grease trap requirements, right? It's a very specific, wonky, policy issue. But they pose huge barriers. Who would think that would cost $30,000 and could ruin somebody's chances of opening their dream restaurant?
Well, and especially just because of the way that it doesn't fit what she's doing.
Right.
It seems like a lot of these kinds of regulations and processes don't really have any match for the kind of unique things that people are trying to do with their businesses.
Yeah, the way you put that actually reminds me of another entrepreneur. This was a coffee shop in Austin, Texas that we spoke with, who had a great little spot in kind of a suburban, urban city neighborhood kind of style. So lots of parking on the street. She was just kind of at a little triangle section. It might have been a pocket park in some cities. But she had become kind of, a pillar of the community. She held events there. Everybody went to that coffee shop for breakfast. She thought, you know what, we have great weather. It's Austin, Texas. I would like to put a couple of picnic benches outside so that people can sit outside and enjoy the weather. Well, she found out as a result of trying to go through the permitting process, to say nothing of the fact that having a permit process to add a couple of picnic benches and tables
kind of sounds ridiculous.
Right, a business you already own and are feeding people at is a little silly. But she was crossing her T's and dotting her I's, found out that would change her minimum parking requirements, and that in order to add a couple of picnic tables, she was going to have to add an X number of parking spaces to her parking lot. Despite the plethora of free street parking available all around her, the fact that her parking lot was never full because most of her customers walked there from the neighborhood. So that's just a service she wasn't able to offer because the physical space didn't exist to comply with a silly regulation intended for a very different part of the city.
This is outside the scope of the study a little bit, but as a history nerd kind of thinking about this, when did these issues start? Because I think when I think of these sorts of permitting processes and licensing requirements, I don't remember them, 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
You're not 40 years old.
I know I'm not 40 years old. Maybe remembering is not the right answer, but I don't remember them being a part of my history class, I guess.
Enough,
I don't know. But I feel like they're of modern vintage. When did cities start to get this involved in the minutia of operating a business?
We tend to think of it as kind of a sedimentary process. So, back in the day, whenever you want to start, right, there was a certain set of rules, and then something happened where something went wrong or someone got hurt or sick or something like that. And so a city says, okay, well, let's put this new rule in to solve that problem. And it just keeps happening. You see it a lot in cities like Philadelphia and Boston that have hundreds of years of history of this. And so the problem with regulations is once you put one in, it is very difficult to get rid of it. We just keep adding new things to solve unique new problems. And so we try to take an approach with cities where we say, hey, it's nobody's fault. You didn't have one mayor that was like, I love regulation, right? But you've just been adding things over the decades, and we're here to help you remove some of that, in a way that makes sense for, today's economy.
Did anything about that, and this is several years ago at this point, but anything about the COVID pandemic change how, cities respond to you guys coming in and trying to, help reduce these things?
I think so. There was definitely, certainly in the wake of the pandemic immediately, there was a lot of interest in trying to help people get back to business. And there was a lot of energy among policymakers because they had to make changes to keep those businesses alive, allowing more to-go services, making adjustments to how restaurants were able to operate on sidewalks, those kinds of things. So they got a little comfortable being flexible, and they saw that well, it turns out the sky doesn't fall when you let people just do their business in a little bit different way and be flexible. I think, as you said, a lot of that has kind of faded by now that we're several years past. But the problems and challenges that the pandemic created, especially for downtown urban cores, I think those persist. And often when those problems persist, that gives us an opportunity to kind of be problem solvers alongside policymakers. So we hear all the time about downtown vacancies, for instance. And it's a great opportunity for us to say, well, gosh, wouldn't it be easier for you to fill those vacancies if a smaller business that doesn't have a lawyer, an accountant, and an architect on staff could actually adjust that space a little bit, change it from its original intended use without going through a mountain of paperwork and without paying a huge mountain of fees, and start up a business and help start to reliven that downtown core.
So what's been the reaction of cities from this work? Because, I can imagine some cities might get defensive when, IJ releases a study that says, here are the 55 some odd ways that you make it hard or impossible to start a new business. But I can also imagine some cities viewing this as a sort of opportunity. Here are ways that we can attract new businesses to our city. Here are ways that we can make our citizens' lives better and easier. What's been the reaction that the two of you have seen?
That's exactly how we phrase it, right? We say, this is an opportunity for you. And so I always say, nobody likes to be told that their baby's ugly. And so cities can get a little defensive. But the thing is that we don't go to a city and put out a press release and say, you're stifling people, so work with us. We go to a city and say, hey, we know you want to support small businesses. We offer this service completely free of charge to help. And so we have cities say, okay, well, first you do this for free. I'm a little skeptical.
Right.
So there is
What's
that.
the catch?
Yeah,
Right.
what's the catch? And we say, no, really. But we develop relationships with these cities. And so then by the time we're making policy recommendations and releasing, our research results, we say, look, you trust us, we trust you. It takes 100 different steps to do this in your city. So this is an opportunity that we have outlined for you. You can get rid of, all of these different steps that we don't think are necessary to keep people safe and healthy. And cities, I think, really embrace that.
And Jenny mentioned the idea of trust. A lot of what we're finding now is that cities are talking to each other and they mention us to each other. So we had Nashville, Tennessee, for instance, reach out to us and say,
oh, wow.
Hey, by the way, we found out that you posted this playbook because, as Jenny says, we're not a private company hiding our intellectual property. We want people to copy this plan and to also do it as force multipliers for us. And Nashville says, hey, we'd like to do this. Can we send you our work and have you check it for us, essentially? So a couple of people in the city government, their role is to already help entrepreneurs through the business process. They were convinced from conversations with other cities that we worked with, hey, these guys are actually helpful. Why don't you give them a call and they'll help walk you through the process? And so that's ongoing, but that's the kind of way that building trust in one city can also lead to opportunities down the line.
So you guys are talking a lot about trust and relationships, and something that I imagine Keith is going to also be inclined to ask is, folks who are listening know that IJ is also very much in the business of, suing city governments. And so is there any tension there for you guys? How does that kind of overlap work?
And specifically Nashville, because I was kind of surprised to hear Nashville come out of your mouth there, Chad, because we've been suing Nashville. I've been suing Nashville now for the last several years in a case involving their home-based business regulations. So how did Nashville decide it wanted to reach out to IJ, the organization that's currently suing them, to try and figure out, hey, how can we make our business regulations a little bit better?
Well, yeah, and we're also working with the city of Philadelphia that we have sued in the past. We're currently suing Seattle. But I think part of it is we have this kind of reputational trust, right, that Chad mentioned, that other cities, talk to each other and say, this is really helpful. Part of it is how we frame it when we come in and say, hey, we want to help you do the right thing. We know you want to support small businesses. So that's a big part of it. But I think another part of it is that, one, cities are sued all the time. And so the folks in maybe the economic development department or the city council, they just care about doing the right thing for their small businesses. So despite that, they're those individuals usually don't have the bad blood. But, for example, we also are not recommending changing the home-based business law in Nashville because we have an active lawsuit about it. So we also, make sure that we stay in communication with the litigation team as well, so that we don't step on any toes and vice versa.
Did you know IJ represents ordinary people, free of charge, as they fight back against government abuse? If you're looking for a rewarding way to support our work, consider becoming a member of our merry band of monthly donors and stand shoulder to shoulder with IJ's clients every month of the year. Monthly donations are convenient and cost-efficient, meaning more of your money goes directly to our fight for freedom and justice. Sign up to donate today at ij.org/monthly.
So one thing that you mentioned is that you're kind of going into cities, and you've talked about this quite a bit about how you kind of make this pitch, right? But there's, I don't even know how many cities in America, thousands, hundreds of thousands?
That's probably a number we should know in this business.
We should know that.
I should have that.
Can one even count that? But how do you prioritize? Because there's just, it seems like it would just be an overwhelming volume of opportunity there.
So I joke about this with new cities all the time because, as Jenny mentioned earlier, there's even some skepticism when we tell them that we're a nonprofit and we're not going to charge them some strange consulting fee to do this work. And the next question from them is usually, how do you pick your cities then? Because if I were a consultant, I would just say, I'll take all the cities and I'll just keep hiring people and growing like a business normally.
Or like, I'll pick the richest cities or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'll pick whoever gives me the most competitive contract. So for us, it's staying on mission, to be perfectly honest. It's looking at a city and saying, do we have the skills in-house? Do we have the capabilities? Do we have the staff and the time and the expertise to make a meaningful change in entrepreneurs' lives? I have been to cities, for instance, that came to us and expressed an interest. We did some baseline research, went to the city, did some interviews, and at the end of the day, we found, there are some things that you can improve, but for us right now, there's probably not a lot that we can do. The bang for the buck just isn't there. And so being mindful of our limited staff time, we said we can't engage with this city right now. I think the other neat thing we can do, though, and this is in part because we aren't traditional contract consultants, is we can be super flexible. So not every city kind of gets the same research, entrepreneur roundtable, formalized report treatment. We just finalized an agreement with the city of Reedsville, North Carolina, for instance, which is a relatively smaller town of 15,000 people. But their heart's in the right place. They want to be a place that encourages growth. They're close to a state border with Virginia, so they're sensitive to those competitive pressures. And they're going through the process of drafting and passing a new development ordinance that's going to govern a lot of this stuff. So after a conversation with them, we offered, hey, we'll take a look at that language, much like we would any legislative draft at the state level, traditional IJ work, and just offer you some pointers or some recommendations of, hey, this might be a pitfall because we've seen it go south in another city, or you might consider adding this because another city that we work in did it and it turned out really well.
Has the city ever been, I guess, conflicted about, bringing about these sorts of changes? I think Jenny kind of alluded to it earlier that, sometimes you have some branches of government that might be really excited about this idea and maybe some other branches that might not be. So have you guys encountered pushback from certain groups of officials or maybe certain interest groups that might be opposed to this kind of reform?
There's always some tension between different departments within cities and things like that. There's also the politics if we're dealing with an elected, city council or a mayor or something like that. The most pushback we get is from health departments usually. And that is because a health department's job is to make sure that people stay safe and healthy. It is not their job to support entrepreneurs. And so we are trying to have a conversation about how do we find the balance between health and safety and reducing regulatory burdens. So we do a lot of work where, we work with the health department and we say, look, we're not deregulating, we're just reducing some of these barriers. And sometimes we can overcome that tension and sometimes we can't, but it helps when we have partners on the ground who have those good relationships between departments. So one of, Chad mentioned earlier, our criteria for selecting cities, one of them is how invested are the folks on the ground? Do we have a mayor who is committed to doing this? And if so, the mayor can have a conversation with an intransigent department, right? But if the people who can make the decisions are not invested in this, then we are less likely to partner with that city because it'll be harder for us to make change.
Right.
And part of it is finding the right opportunity in a city as well. So we can find maybe a dozen different reform recommendations that would exist in an ideal world and recommend all of those to a city. But even a city that's willing to work with us, a department that's specifically engaged, is probably not going to bite on all 12 of those recommendations. So there's a concept in fencing, this idea of the tactical wheel, where you strike where your opponent gives you the opening and vice versa. So a lot of that is the strategy of what reforms we recommend in the first place, based on the feedback we get. And then once we make those recommendations and those reform ideas get out there, we get additional feedback from policymakers about what's the third rail and is never going to get passed. And we don't want to spend all of our time and energy getting a small win that's going to alienate them for everything else if we can get 5 or 6 other items. So that's then where we put our effort and energy.
We see that a lot with finances. So we almost always recommend you should lower your fees, and here's specifically how to do that. For some cities, that's just not an option. They're in a budget deficit, and they say, look, the financial stuff is off the table for now. And we say, okay, that's fine. Let's talk about your temporary vending permits, right? Let's talk about how to get more people permitted to be able to do those kind of things. And that seems to work really well for us.
The health department opposition that you mentioned earlier is really interesting to me because it does seem like, you talked about kind of these laws sort of stacking on top of each other because of, potentially things that had actually happened. And, there is potentially some legitimate health and safety concerns here. And so I could see why the sort of health departments would be the most rigid in a way. What have you found to be kind of most persuasive or effective in helping them feel comfortable with kind of stepping back or putting more flexibility into the process?
I think a lot of that actually comes from work that IJ has done in the past. I mean, a lot of our traditional food freedom and cottage food portfolio gives us a wealth of experience to say, look, if you're worried about this small change in the restaurant industry, consider how often we've been working with home-based bakers and home-based food producers operating out of their kitchen. And we can still say to this day that we don't have any confirmed cases from one of those home kitchens of a foodborne illness coming from that origin. So we actually have a lot of information, anecdotes, as well as good research to try to assuage some of those concerns from policymakers.
We also often, if we aren't getting anywhere with a health department, sometimes for lowering those burdens, a lot of times we push for greater clarity because what we hear from entrepreneurs too is I am happy to follow the rules. I just need to know what they are.
Sure.
Right. So one of the things that we've had success with in Philadelphia and a couple other places is instituting an inspection checklist. So when the health department comes to inspect a restaurant, for example, there's a checklist that the entrepreneur has ahead of time so that they know, okay, this is exactly what's going to be required of me so that I can comply with the regs. And that is, often half the battle so that people just know the standard they're being held to, right? And it's something that cities are open to adopting because, one, they don't have to change their ordinance to do it. They can make an administrative change, right? And two, it's something that they can say, look, we are doing our best. We are trying to give you all of the information you need. That seems to work too.
And I'm sure what's helped as well, especially now that City's work has been around for some time, they've started to rack up some successes that we now have a track record that we can point to of, hey, if you cooperate with us and institute some of these reforms, you can help small businesses and you won't see these sort of fictitious harms that opponents kind of raise in this context. What are some of the biggest successes that City's work has had so far?
We have had a lot of success with the city of Shreveport, Louisiana, and we released our research for them sometime last year, so it's been less than a year that they've been implementing this. But they have completely overhauled their website, for example. So let's make it easier for entrepreneurs to navigate the process to start a business. I mentioned how difficult it is to get those physical forms to get a liquor license. Those are all online now. So the city is really making those steps, and they're very committed to doing that. And so the benefit of that work is they see kind of how it helps entrepreneurs, and then that gives them appetite for additional reform. So we've seen cities like Kansas City, Missouri, adopted a new ordinance requiring data tracking so that it will help us understand entrepreneurs in the future and then push for additional reforms. We got a new home-based business ordinance passed in Bismarck, North Dakota that frees things up for home-based entrepreneurs. We have had a lot of changes actually in the city of St. Louis. So for example, their cottage food law at the city level was more strict than the state. So we were able to very easily, I think, get a new ordinance passed to bring that up into line with state law. We also got rid of a law there that unfairly restricted barbershops to where they had to close at 6:30 every night, even though hair salons didn't. And through our research, we discovered that there was actually a really ugly history trying to restrict the kind of African-American barbering industry from back 100 years ago. And so once we brought it to their attention and we said, hey, this is a problem. I don't think you guys are really enforcing it, but it could be used to enforce against someone unfairly. We were able to get that change through. It was a very popular change to make. So it, makes the Board of Aldermen look good that they're doing positive things. We got press coverage in the Washington Post on it. And that was a really exciting one for us.
Well, and I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Jenny, about how so many of these regulations just kind of rise up just by sedimentary action, right? They're added to the code a century ago. No one thinks about them. City officials aren't enforcing them, but they nonetheless provide these real barriers to people who are trying to put up a business.
Because, again, as Jenny mentioned, even something that isn't being enforced, you as the entrepreneur never know when someone new is going to take office and come in and decide, well, now I'm going to enforce it. And you've been operating this way for a long time. Now I'm shutting you down.
So what can viewers do to make their own cities a better place to start a business?
It's a perfect time to ask this question, actually, because one of the newest cities we just started engaging with and their county council just voted to formally partner with Cities Work comes from Los Alamos in New Mexico. And I think it's possible, maybe even one of our viewers had reached out to us. I guess they were connected with a local business coalition and said, gosh, it seems like it's really hard to start a business here. Seems like you all do some of this work. Why don't you look into Los Alamos? So that was kind of an entry point. I can't remember if it was you, Kim, or you, Keith, that mentioned earlier kind of finding these projects to begin with. But sometimes it really is folks coming to us and saying, I had a really hard time starting this business, or my brother-in-law is a contractor, and gosh, does he have horror stories about the permitting process in X city. So just letting us know what the process is like in your city, or especially if there's already some kind of local business coalition or a local chamber operating, having them reach out to us or putting us in touch with them is a great way to just put something on our radar so we can start that conversation.
People can also go to our website, which is citieswork.org, and they can see all of our research. So maybe we've done research on their city already, and they can take that published research to their city council and say, hey, you should engage with Cities Work. They can also download our playbook, which I think Chad mentioned earlier, literally outlines everything that we do and how we do it. So they can download our playbook and go to their city council or their economic development department and say, why don't you try some of these things? And if they give us a call, we are happy to walk them through that playbook like we are with Nashville. We are happy to meet cities where they're at. And so folks can really just approach us when they're ready, and we will figure out how we can best help them and guide them.
So if I'm a city council member, it really is just as easy as going on citieswork.org and reaching out to one of you, and I can get this process started in my own community?
I think the only way we could make it easier is if we actually found a way to buy 1-800-CITIES-WORK. I'll have to count the number of letters on that.
Yeah.
But essentially, that's exactly right.
Wow.
So what's the best way for people to kind of write in and contact us if they want us to check out their city?
Very easy. People can email us at citieswork@ij.org, and that'll forward to me. We can take a look and hopefully figure out how we can work together.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, guys, for coming in and talking with us today. And thanks to all of you for watching. If you want to learn more about the other work that IJ does, you can like and subscribe our channel. And if you want to support this work, you can join us with just $5 a month. Thanks so much.
Thanks again for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and tune in for more videos.